This is the I Read Comic Books podcast. I am your host, Mike Rapin. Joining me this week, two friendly library patrons and a professional librarian, Paul Jasley.
Hello, humanoids.
And Tia Vasilio.
Hello.
And for this episode of I Read Comic Books, we have a very special guest, the one and only Amie Wright. Amie, welcome to the show, or welcome back to the show, I should say.
Thanks so much for having me.
I'm super excited to talk comics and everything with you today, but I guess for the folks at home who maybe don't know who you are, could you give us a little brief bio about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I am a professional librarian, though currently I am on a library sabbatical and I'm doing my PhD in history, researching the history of comic censorship. But for a very long time, and still now, I have been involved with the American Library Association Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable, long name, but basically comics involved with comics librarianship, and I actually served as the first president of the Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable.
Amazing. I think that's how we met with you years and years ago. Way back, it was at a con. We ran into each other and we were like, holy smoke, someone who's actually on the front lines of like comic book stuff in libraries, which everybody was very excited about. So super glad we were able to have you come back to the show.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, I guess let's just dive right into things. I guess we're going to talk about comic books that we've read recently. So I got to ask these two legally mandated questions, which is how have you been? How have comic books been? Paul, let's start with you.
Mike, I've been great. It is basically full-blown summer here in West Michigan. For those that are waiting for the West Michigan weather report, we are upper 60s, beautiful sunshine today, great weather to walk to someplace to sit inside and read comics, which is what I did yesterday.
Nice.
So I read a couple things, and a couple things stood out to me that I want to talk about here in the show. Number one was Deep Cuts #1. This is a new miniseries from Image Comics, written by Kyle Higgins and Joe Clark. Art by Danilo Beyruth, colors by Igor Monti, and letters by the one and only Hassan Otsmane Alao. This is a miniseries that's all about jazz music in the early, 1917. That's when the story takes place, back down in New Orleans. Follows the young clarinet player named Charles Stewart, who is looking to make a big break into the music scene there in New Orleans in the early part of the jazz scene that's springing up at the time. And he joins up with a hotshot trumpet player named Jack Cartier. This book, it's so interesting. Like, I really love books that try to capture the emotions and feelings of musicians. It's very difficult to do to portray music on a comic book page. And I think this book does a really good job. It captures the spirit and tone of New Orleans at the time. It probably helps that Joe Clark, one of the co-writers, is a musician himself. He's a composer.
Oh, nice.
So I think they get a good sense of like how to talk about music and show it without feeling like, it doesn't feel static. It doesn't feel like it's very natural. The way that the musicians talk about it to each other, it feels like you're reading something that a musician actually wrote and is involved in. I really like the way that the story, it does help that it's a oversized issue. You get a lot of background information about all the characters here, but again, it never feels like you're getting a big exposition dump. All the interactions with the characters kind of like build up the story about Charles Stewart. He's a young boy whose father died when he was very young. His father, a musician, so he's trying to follow in his father's footsteps. And he gets a job with Jack Cartier. They start playing music at a brothel. And Charles Stewart's very religious grandmother is not very happy about that. But you get a really rich sense of the music scene there in the brothel. You get a sense of the characters, the relationship to each other, the way that the musician who takes Charles under his wing might not be everything he claims to be, might be kind of a hustler. And I like the way that the story kind of brings you along with that without actually making it super explicit, without, telling you everything up front. Like, you get the interactions and the histories with the characters through their conversations. And it does help that the artwork shows music in a very sort of like lively way. Overall, I really enjoyed this book a lot. I'm kind of excited to see where the story goes from here. And I think what's funny is, like, because Joe Clark is a musician, like the back matter, you get a little, basically a piece of like sheet music. And like, I can't read music. I have no idea what's happening here, but it looks great, right? You get a new original piece of music by a musician, a contemporary jazz musician writing a piece. So I guess if you do read music, you can kind of like look at that and see what it sounds like. I hope at some point somebody actually records some of this stuff so I know what exactly is happening here. But overall, it's a really, really beautiful comic, a nice page, a nice collection. And
Gotcha.
I'm kind of curious to see where that story goes.
Yeah, that sounds fun. My only question for you, Paul, is how does this tie into the Massive or the Massive verse? Sorry, the Radiant Black verse or whatever that Kyle Higgins has.
Again, this is only the first issue. There's a lot of story to tell. At some point,
That's it.
Radiant
Yeah.
Black might show up. So,
Right. Okay. Perfect. Well, that's great. Well, Tia, let's jump over to you. How have you been? How have comic books been?
Hi. So a little bit sad this past week. And I learned that the owner operator of the only local comic shop that has ever felt like my local comic shop, Earthworld Comics. I learned that J.C. Glenmeyer, who ran it for 35 years, owned and operated, he passed away last week, which is extremely sad. And I would say that comic books lost a superhero. And so I've just been, sort of nostalgic, I guess, reminiscing about how important that shop was to me when I was up in the Albany area and didn't really know anyone, didn't have any friends. The shop would have ladies' nights, and JC would be the bouncer and keep everybody safe, keep everybody safe and happy. There'd be snacks, like only women staff would be working. We'd have games, and I don't know, it just like he really created a wonderful community in that shop. So if you are in the area, if you know Earthworld, I think they're doing like a public memorial next Sunday on the 21st at McGarry's Irish Pub. But if you don't, and you're just thinking like, oh, that's sad, stop by your local comic shop, let them know you appreciate them, because I would say, they do it out of love for comics, right? Like it's a hard job. So yeah, let them know you appreciate them. And so, not on purpose. And in fact, I was thinking the last show I was on a few weeks ago was about death. And I don't know why I didn't read this book for that episode, but since I'm just on the topic of, I can make anything about death. I'm Tia. I can always bring it back to that. So I read Two Graves number 6. If people have been listening to the show this year, my episodes, you know that this was a series I was actually really excited about, and have been like following very excitedly. I love how kind of ambiguous some parts of the story are. I love how different elements of like the lettering and the artwork really tell the story. It's a super simple story, right? There's a young woman who is traveling across the country to put her mother's ashes to rest in the ocean, and she's traveling with this strange entity who like maybe is a reaper, and he's got this mysterious mark on his neck, and they're kind of running from these other reapers. And so this is the final issue in the series. So we get I'm going to be vague about the like details of the plot because I don't want to spoil it for anyone. I think you should really read this series, but I will say I love the way death is represented here as an entity. Like the artwork is definitely giving sort of like Slender Man, Hat Man, Shadow Man, which, have you guys seen this? Like, I can't take Benadryl because I owe the Hat Man money thing on the internet.
I have seen this. It strikes a chord in like a very small portion of fear in my brain that I will one day wake up to something standing in my room in the middle of the night, but it's also very funny.
It's so creepypasta, right? Like,
100%.
Yeah. So, but like the depiction of this entity and also the lettering for the way that this entity it's so good. Aditya Bidikar does the lettering for this book. It's so good. Like you can see this entity's voice echoing, which is just amazing. And so Amelia, the young woman, had just said like a page or two before the entity appears that she thought death was empty, but this is a darkness that's alive. And I really like that subtle contradiction between her making that observation, but then the like voice just echoing like it's in this empty place. And so thematically, I think this is a really cool story about the tension between feeling powerful and like taking charge of your own destiny, but also embracing inevitability and kind of knowing where the difference is, or maybe even like exploring the power in embracing inevitability, if that makes sense. So some profound stuff going on. And also it's a story about love, and especially love that can't be reciprocated with in different ways. Like maybe the person is dead. Maybe the person just like can't exist in the same place with you at the same time. And so like how do you embrace that inevitability? And then also, no spoilers, just a question I'll put to the group. How soon is too soon to reuse mythology from other recent popular series?
Like like if there's a, I guess Thor is the weird exception here, right? But are you talking about like characters that may have showed up from like the Greek mythos, but like not normally portrayed in like major mainstream comics, and then someone else also doing a story about like Greek characters, something like that?
Sort of. I mean, like, obviously, no one owns mythology, and there no two ways that they are woven into a story are going to be exactly the same. But to me, like, I don't know if I would. You can't help what like cultural references get attached to certain things. And so if I'm trying to create an original book, I'm not sure I would want to use character names or like reference mythology that I know for a big segment of my likely reading demographic is going to immediately reference some other series. You know what I mean?
Gotcha. Yeah.
I don't know. That's a tough question, I think, because like obviously no one owns mythology. Like you can't help it,
Right.
but
I mean, and then there's just some folks that are just like, give me more Greek mythology stories. I don't care who you are, just give me more of that. It's like, okay. I mean, Lore Olympus is like proof of that, right? That like people are clamoring for that, I guess, and they will read this to the end of time. I don't know, but that's an interesting question, regardless.
Yeah.
Well, Amie, what about you? How have you been? How have comic books been? What have you been reading?
So I am entering, I guess, almost in my third year of my PhD. So a lot of the reading I've been doing is very historical with comics. I have been revisiting a lot of origin stories of classic superheroes, especially Captain America. Nice. I love that Penguin Classics has reissued a whole bunch of Marvel. So they have Amazing Spider-Man, Black Panther, Captain America that they've reissued in Penguin Classic editions. So you can get them full color in paperbacks, or even a really nice, fantastic coffee table version. So this one it is edited by Ben Saunders, who I know was recently on your show. And Ben, of course, was the curator for the Marvel exhibit that made the rounds in the past few years. And this one for Captain America also has a foreword from Jean Lewin Yang, very famous cartoonist, but of course, fantastically with American-born Chinese coming out this month. And so I've been really liking just what's nice about this collected edition is that you get to read, of course, the issues as they came out, but it's an edited, introduction to the character and all the different iterations of Captain America, and also to have the feedback from folks like Ben Saunders and Jean Yang about how they perceived Captain America, and even just to get more about the origin stories. For me, totally, if you will, dorkily, but one of the things I think is really important to point out is that like Captain America came out before the US had actually joined World War II. And I think that's something that's not talked about enough. And, I think maybe within comics, inside baseball, like we do talk a lot about, Joe Simon and Jack Kirby and their personal backgrounds and what they brought to the character. But I don't think enough of people outside of comics know that, like, here are, Jewish Americans talking about the fact that the U.S. has not joined the war effort. The U.S., like a lot of countries, has not been amenable to the plight of Jewish refugees that were trying to, find homes going into like 1938, 1939. So also, Captain America is fantastic. So, there are so many reasons to know and love it. So I've been really enjoying revisiting those, while I'm also sifting through hundreds of books. I'm pulling together my PhD research proposal, which I was working on right before we logged on. So.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Well, but it sounds like, at least at the end of the day, you get to read some entertaining comics as part of
Right.
this work, right?
Oh, 100%. And I get to be like,
Yeah.
oh, this is why you should care about Captain America, because I will soon have my PhD in history. I mean, that's my takeaway.
No, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah. Huh.
I'm looking forward to getting like a signed document from you that says like, you should love Captain America, signed Dr. Wright. Like,
I know. I mean, I don't know if he's ever guested on your show, but Matthew No, who is the outgoing former president for the Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable, he does a lot of work within graphic medicine. And was one of the founders of a lot of the graphic medicine collectives. But with his last name, No, and we're like, man, one day we're going to be Dr. Wright and Dr. No, like doctors of doctors of comics librarianship, right?
I love it. Oh, that's amazing.
Wow.
Well, let me jump in. I guess for me, I have not been reading comic books because I have been fully immersed in The Legend of Zelda. For those of you who maybe have been living under a rock, I don't know, maybe you didn't know this, but a new Legend of Zelda game came out, The Tears of the Kingdom, and Friday I picked up the game at 11 a.m., sat down, turned my Switch on, and I've been playing it almost nonstop since then, and it is Sunday at 3:30. I was literally playing this morning before the show. Like, I forced myself to read some comic books because I knew I had to do that this week. But it's been nonstop Zelda, and as soon as we finish this show, I'm kicking that Switch back on to do that. So I don't know if any of you had this recent obsession, but I think I've already put like 20 hours into this game since it came out on Friday. But I recommend it. It's a lot of fun. Clearly, it's an addiction. It's a problem. But I read Strange Academy Finals #6. This is by Scotty Young and Humberto Ramos. We get an end of this Strange Academy series. If anyone has not been reading this, the gist of it is there's this magic school in Louisiana founded by Dr. Voodoo, and he has basically recruited all of the magic adults in the Marvel Universe to bring young and up-and-coming teenagers and kids who have magical abilities to basically learn how to use them. It's very, I don't want to say Harry Potter because it's not at all. It just happens to be a magic school. But, you get the tropes of like, oh, here are the cool kids, and here are the kids that learned how to use magic from their parents, and this person has a magic jacket. Are they actually a magic user? So you get all the, the fun stuff that you get, when you get when you put a bunch of teenagers together in school. And Scotty Young does a fantastic job of giving each and every one of the main characters like a distinct voice and everything, where you can latch on to a character and learn to love them as the series goes on, or learn to hate them as the series goes on, which is kind of how this series ends, with two characters that you wouldn't have think that you'd love and hate have switched sides. One becomes the good guy, one becomes the bad guy, and there's this kind of ultimate showdown. And there's a tearjerker moment. I mean, it's a pretty good round out for this all ages book. According to the editor at the end of this series, they said this isn't the end, but we'll see. This kind of feels like the end of Runaways, where it's like, oh, the Runaways aren't gone. They're still going to exist in the Marvel Universe. And then we get one Runaways book every year just to tie into the most recent event, until Rainbow Rowell showed up and then reinvigorated the entire line. But I don't know. We'll see if Scotty Young and Humberto Ramos come back to do more in the future. But I guess it's nice to get some of Ramos's art where he's not forced, or he was probably forced to not draw teenage girls with 2-inch miniskirts for a change, because that's all he did when he drew the X-Men, and it was a little unsettling. So it was nice to like see him put a lot of effort into a book and have it look really pretty and not have to feel weird about it. So that's what I was reading. But Paul, what about you? Well, I know you've got one other book, and I've got two other books. Sure. Because of course I do. But what else did you read?
The other book I read recently, wanted to talk about on the show. I raved about the first issue a couple weeks ago, but it is Unstoppable Doom Patrol #2, written by Dennis Culver, art by Chris Burnham, colors by Brian Reber, and letters by Pat Brousseau. Mike, are you reading this series? Have you picked this up?
I have not. Should I?
Okay. Yes, because I don't mean this as a slight. This feels like a better version of what I want from X-Men comics. I don't know. There's something about this current...
Okay.
This current Doom Patrol status quo is very X-Men. The team is tracking down, these new metahumans that are popping up in the DC universe. They're bringing them into the fold, giving them a place to be comfortable. It is very much the classic Chris Claremont X-Men like status quo, but it's the Doom Patrol.
Okay.
And for me, that's very much what I want. So, and this, I don't want to spoil anything. There is a very, very specific X-Men reference in this issue that actually made me laugh out loud when I realized what was happening. So I kind of want you to read this at some point to see if you have the same reaction.
Okay. I'll fire up that DC Universe Infinite Extreme Ultimate, whatever it's called, and give it a read.
It's very fun. So again, in this issue, again, the team tracks down a new metahuman named Worm. They bring them to the Doom Patrol headquarters, and I love that this series somehow is able to kind of bring in all the different versions of the Doom Patrol. So you not only get references to the Morrison Doom Patrol, you get reference to the previous version of Doom Patrol that Paul Kupperberg was doing before Morrison took over. So like the headquarters for the Doom Patrol is in Kansas, which is where like that original pre-Morrison Doom Patrol took place. You get Chris Burnham doing a beautiful headquarters establishing shot, double page spread where you see like the cross section of the building, all the different floors. It is like the X-Men training facility. You know, there is basically a quote unquote danger room where they're all training in. And there's references to other past characters. There's a great moment where Cliff Steele, Robot Man, goes to visit the grave of Dorothy Spinner, who was a character from the Doom Patrol in the 80s and 90s. And we get a little more background on what the status of the team is. It turns out, I thought the first issue that basically Jane had taken over as the chief. That's still the case. The chief is one of Jane's personalities, but Niles Calder is still around. Like he's overseeing the larger sort of like structural, economic and political aspect of the Doom Patrol, whereas the chief, one of Jane's personalities, is kind of managing the day-to-day operations of the Doom Patrol. You get to see their interactions, which is really fascinating because Jane's personalities are very distinct and like they don't always get along with other people. So it's kind of fun to see that power dynamic playing out, especially to see Niles Calder like not being calling all the shots.
Interesting.
So I think overall this series is kind of like, I was always skeptical about the series because I think the Doom Patrol is something that means a lot to me. Again, Mike, you and I read all of the Morrison Doom Patrol. That's a very, very important series for me personally. And it's always kind of weird to see someone kind of take over those characters, and I'm not sure they're going to treat them the way I want them to be treated. So far, Dennis Culver and Chris Burnham are doing an amazing job. I really love the way they're able to kind of call all of the Doom Patrol history over the decades into this book and make it feel unique and special. And really, again, like make that team feel distinct and give them a new status quo where they actually have a mission that they're accomplishing. There is a sort of Suicide Squad tie-in here. Again, I don't want to give too many spoilers about this book because I love it so much. I want people to experience it on their own. But I think they're setting up a big cliffhanger already in the second issue of this miniseries, and I cannot wait to see where they go from here.
Yeah, it sounds great. I have to check this out because I don't know if you're saying it feels like X-Men vibes. You know, I'm down at least to give it a shot.
Yeah.
I think here's the thing about this, Paul. You're weirding me out here. You're like, oh, it feels like X-Men, but then you said it feels like Claremont X-Men, and you know how I feel about Chris Claremont. So like,
okay, yeah.
We're going to see how we're at this point. It's a challenge. I have to do it. So I'm going to report back for the next time you're on the show. I'll have read at least issue 1, maybe issue 2. We'll see.
And again, it's strange because like I've read enough of the Claremont X-Men and read other X-Men where it's like I have an idea what I want from the X-Men, and this is what I want from X-Men comics, and by and large, X-Men comics don't give me what I want from X-Men comics. So this is the best version of it, you know.
This is interesting. Now I don't know how to read anything because even Danny's jumping in the chat and saying I should read this. So, okay, that's fine. That's fine. Or really quick then, I guess before we get into the top of our pile, I should have said this first. I was sticking to the brand. I'm obsessed with Legend of Zelda right now, so I decided let's try these Legend of Zelda manga books that are out there. And so I read the first chapter of 2 different books just to get a sampling. I read the Legend of Zelda 4 Swords Chapter 1. Both of these are by Akira Himekawa. 4 Swords, and then I read the first chapter of the Ocarina of Time book as well. So the 4 Swords book is really hokey. It's super contrived to get into the story of, all right, we need Link to go save Zelda, and there needs to be 4 of him somehow. And if you guys don't know anything about Zelda, that's fine, or Legend of Zelda, that's fine. Like ultimately, they made a game where there's 4 Links. There's a red one, there's a blue one, there's the traditional green one, and then there's a purple one. And Zander is editing this. He's probably going to like pull all of the hair out of my head when he hears me say this, but like they're supposed to represent like all the various pieces of the Triforce, including a mysterious missing fourth one. Zander literally gave like a 25-minute presentation about like how all of the games have led up to this Tears of the Kingdom game. Anyways, Four Swords is weird. It's hokey. They split Link into people by pulling a sword out of a stone, and then he has to go save Zelda. And each of the little Links have their own different personality traits. Like one's angry and one's kind, and the other one is adventurous, and the other one is scared because, of course. So it's really goofy. Probably not going to read more. However, the Ocarina of Time like manga book that they put out, this is less contrived because I mean, and I say that like roughly because honestly, it's a Legend of Zelda game. Like the plots are very, very, very thin. They're just a reason for you to go into dungeons and fight monsters and yada, yada. But the Ocarina of Time game actually has like a pretty decent story where you're this kid Link, you wake up in the forest where you've grown up your whole life. You don't know who your parents are. You have to go fight a monster that has taken over the giant talking tree that's at the center of town. And you kind of just have to accept that that's the way that the world works here. And then it turns out you're the hero of time. You're the person that's supposed to help save the world after Princess Zelda, who's supposed to be the reincarnation of like a goddess, has been captured by Ganon, this super evil monster man. So yeah, the manga actually reads, and it turns out it's actually good to read. So yeah, I figured I'd try that stuff after it's been like sitting out there on the internet for forever. But yeah, anyways, got to stay on brand this week because I'm going to go back and only play video games for the rest of the week. But yeah, let's, I don't know. I feel like if you have no idea what Legend of Zelda is, everything that I just said is a bunch of gibberish, and that's totally fine.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Well, let's move on. Let's talk about comics that are on the top of our pile, books that we're looking forward to reading, whether they're new or old, or just something that's been sitting on your shelf for forever. So Tia, let's go back to you. What's on the top of your pile?
Well, everyone knows I'm a big fan of Simon Hanselman and the like Mega Hex world, and there's going to be another book coming out in I think August 1st from Fantagraphics, Werewolf Jones and Sons Deluxe Summer Fun Annual. Simon Hanselman and Josh Pettinger are both credited. So like, okay, Werewolf Jones is probably the most disgusting character in this series, I would say, or like the most just like filthy, unhinged character. And I think that part of the reason is because he's a dad and he has the two sons. And so it's like, it's one thing to be just like an absolute disgusting dirtbag if you're just like, you know, some single person hanging out with your friends, but to make it to put that on a character who's actually a parent, I think just like amplifies how completely chaotic and unhinged these characters are. But I love it, and I can't wait to see how like horrific this book is in the best way.
It's one thing to do a book that features Werewolf Jones, right? But it's a different thing to do a book that stars Werewolf Jones, I think. If you know anything about the Megan Mogg series, yeah, I can't imagine what unhinged insanity is going to come out of that book. If only because yeah.
Like it's also, I think, a great pick for this episode topic because, you know, a lot of the like censorship of comics is like, because won't someone think of the children? And this is just like, no, we're gonna fuck those kids up. Fuck them kids.
If someone is giving Megan Mogg comics to children, I think that we should actually be calling them into question about it because like children should not be reading these books, right? Like
Mike Rapin, pro censorship in comics.
Wait, no, hold on, wait. Oh man, you know it's funny. I got this confused with the zine that Simon Hanselman put out. I think it's called "You Will Own Nothing and You Will Be Happy," which is like a black and white book that they did like a limited print of, and they're probably going to collect it later because that's what Hanselman seems to do. But yeah, I'm glad that there's like more Megan Mogg stuff. And by the way, I am 100% very happy that you turned me onto this series way back in the day, because I'm obsessed now, and it's all because of you. Take that how you will.
I'm pleased to be of service in that way.
Amazing. Well, Paul, what about you? What's on top of your pile?
Well, it's probably no surprise here. This book came out last week, but I haven't been to the shop yet to pick it up. So as soon as I get my hands on it, I'll be reading The Best of 2000 AD Volume 3. I've absolutely loved this series. I raved about the first two volumes here on the show. It is the introduction to the long-running British anthology series 2000 AD. Every volume of this so far has been incredible. You get a classic Dread story, you get a new Dread story, as well as some like classic 2000 AD other non-Dredd comics, which is always nice to see, since that's my main entry point to 2000 AD is Judge Dredd. For this particular volume, we get a new Judge Dredd story called Ghosts, written by Michael Carroll, art by Mark Sexton. We also get one of my favorite Judge Dredd stories of all time, The Graveyard Shift by John Wagner, Alan Grant, and Ron Smith. That story is incredible. That might be worth, if you're on the fence about this, buy this collection just for that story. It is so great. We also get some non-Judge Dredd stuff. Storming Heaven by Gordon Rennie and Fraser Irving. Always nice to see Fraser Irving artwork. And then Leviathan by Ian Eddington and Disraeli. Disraeli is an amazing artist. Again, did a lot of work for 2000 AD. So again, I know I raved about this series enough, but I think they're doing an amazing job of just giving you so much great material. Like these, I'm always shocked just how many great comics they're able to squeeze into these collections. It's worth every penny if you get it physically or digitally. I think if you have any interest in 2000 AD or just want to read some interesting comics, obviously Judge Dredd, but also just some great sci-fi comics, these volumes are worth every penny.
Yeah, I really got to get my hands on these. I've been putting it off, but I think now is the time, right?
The time is now.
Especially if this book has one of your favorite Dredd stories, because yes. I feel like you have not led me down any wrong paths when it comes to like recommended Dredd stories. So like that's high praise right there, Paul.
Yeah, I mean the Graveyard Shift really is a story where you get to see what it's like to live in Mega City 1. It's one night in Mega City 1, and you get to follow Dredd and some other judges around what they're doing each night. And it kind of feels like the opening of the recent Dredd movie. I say recent, it's over 10 years old at this point, but the 2012 Dredd movie, you get dropped into Mega City 1 and just kind of deal with the overwhelming sort of chaos of it. And that story feels like it was a huge inspiration for that film.
Awesome. Amie, what about you? What's on the top of your pile this week?
So I am we're hosting a webinar through the Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable this upcoming Wednesday. It is the final webinar in a 3-part series that we've been running about dealing with bans and challenges with comic book titles. And we're actually very happy that we have Trung Lee Nguyen joining us, creator of The Magic Fish. And nice. I am embarrassed that I read Magic Fish when it first came out in 2020, and it's one that I need to revisit, and I'm excited to revisit, given that Trung is joining us on the webinar on Wednesday. What's been really nice about this title, we have seen it popping up on a few bans and challenge lists because, of course, it's sort of described as semi-autobiographical about a teenager who's wrestling how to come out to his mom, who's originally from Vietnam. And so it has popped up on some bans and challenge lists, but we've also seen it pop up on some awards lists too, which has been really nice. Like right now, it's actually a nominee for the Nutmeg Awards in Connecticut for a title for grades 9 to 12. So it's nice that it's getting some other attention and not just stuff that is less than opportune.
Yeah, this book super rules. I don't know. I feel like it's definitely one that I need to reread, probably, because I read it in 2020 as well, but I don't think I read it since it came out.
Oh, totally. And we were talking earlier about mythology and, how that is sort of interwoven with so many different stories. And that's actually something, just when we were talking about mythology earlier in the conversation, I'm like, oh, I want to reread it, especially with like an eye to that.
Definitely. We'll have to get a link to that webinar. I don't know if you guys do recordings or whatever, but we'll have to grab something and hopefully embed it in the show notes so that folks can check that out.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Well, I guess before I get into my pick, we, as always, have folks hanging out with us on Discord, and we've got some folks with their top of their pile picks. So Danny is going to be reading Disney Villains Maleficent number... Danny, you're reading Disney Villains Maleficent number 1? Okay, I'll leave you there. Graham is reading Hell's Paradise Jingo Kuraku by Yuji Kaku, and Paul is reading Top 10 by Alan Moore, Gene Ha, and Kyle Starks, which I don't know if that's because I mentioned Top 10 recently, but I've got that big, thick compendium that's hanging out on my shelf of the collected Top 10, and I'm glad someone else is reading that series because it's very, very good. But the book that I am looking forward to reading next is The Great Disappointment. This is by Box Brown, which is a collection of short comics by Brown covering a small smattering of nonfiction and autobio comics from 2011. I'm really curious to see some of Box's early work, given that his style has, I think, become more solidified in the way that he draws now. Skimming through the book, it's a very different artistic style, and I noticed that some of the stories inside kind of cover some more serious, like, religious topics, which I've never seen Box tackle before. And I looked this up a little bit. The title of the book is a reference to an incident that happened in 1844 where the Millerite movement was they reacted to this Baptist preacher named William Miller's proclamation that Jesus Christ would return to earth by 1844, which he called the Second Advent, and it didn't happen. And so there was this great disappointment. So if that kind of like sets where this book is going to be coming from, I'm very interested to see where this, I think that's one of the stories as well as a couple of others. So should be interesting. One of the things I will note is I also saw that there's like, I was flipping through the pages and there's this huge page that just says Satan wins. Which I just want to print out and put on a wall because I think that's so funny. So yeah, looking forward to that. And finishing, I think, collecting all of the Box Brown books that I can get my hands on now on one nice shelf. Should be pretty cool.
Nice. Yeah.
But yeah, I guess
this was coming out. I'll have to track that down.
Well, it actually came out a while ago. So like I don't know if folks at home know, but I was on an episode of the Comics That We Love podcast, and we talked about Box Brown's Tetris, the games people play. And we kind of timed it with that movie coming out, the Tetris movie that came out. They're not related by any means, but we were like, yeah, perfect timing. No. And as part of that show, I did a little bit of research and to make sure that I had some talking points for Box Brown. I realized that there was like 4 or 5 books of his that I didn't own, and I was like scrambling on the internet to be like, I have to own all of these. My library must be complete. Then I got this one. So
gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. But yeah, so I'll let you know what I think, Paul. Who knows? It might be utter rubbish, which is probably why neither of us had heard of it before.
Right. But I know he's got a new book coming out soon about the history of He-Man, which I'm very excited about. So yeah. It's about, I think it's He-Man and like how collectible toys destroyed people's childhoods or something like that. Something like that. Yeah.
Really fun stuff. But yeah, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk more with Amie about censorship and book bans and book challenges and stuff in the library system. So we'll be back in just a second. Before we get into the topic for this week's show, got a little housekeeping, switching things up on you folks. I just want to remind everyone that you can follow us on the internet on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. We've got a Discord. We've got our Goodreads group. We've got our reading challenge that's going on. We've got a YouTube channel. All of those links are in the show notes, to make sure to check those out. And we have a Patreon at patreon.com/IRCB podcast, where you can get access to a better Batmobile, IRCB Movie Club, and literally over 100 exclusive episodes of content just for our Patreon. That's at patreon.com/IRCB podcast. Just wanted to throw a reminder out there, but let's get into things. We brought Amie onto today's show to talk about censorship and book challenges in the comic book industry, specifically in libraries. Amie, you sent over a really cool article about preparing and addressing challenges for comics in libraries. I guess, could you talk us through that a little bit, and then maybe we can jump around with some other things?
Well, 100%. So I left library land to go back to school in January 2019 to study historical comic book censorship, right? And I have to say, at the time, I think a few folks, well, grad school in general, it's costly and takes a lot of time, and people are like, good luck with that. Right. And, fast forward just, about a year. And of course, I think the biggest headline was, of course, Mouse being pulled from Tennessee schools, and late, this is 2000. We had heard that the challenges were kind of heating up through, 2020, especially as with folks being at home with their kids. And then, Mouse gets pulled fall 2020. Also, very notably, and it may not make, everybody's radar because it's a kid's comic, but Jerry Craft's New Kid, which is the first graphic novel to win the Newbery Award for Excellence in Children's Literature, was pulled from a huge number of schools. Jerry Craft had school visits canceled. So and this is all to say, yeah, and also just like a lovely human being.
Yeah.
So this is all to say, Mouse is fall 2021. So this is all to say in early 2022, I had sort of been on a bit of a sabbatical from the library organization for about a year and a half while I finished my master's thesis in history, and I was starting my PhD. The Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable is like, wow, your historical research on comic censorship is pretty useful now. Can you come back and start this new committee? So, yeah. And so February 2022, we started this new committee. It was originally struck as a short-term committee. We wanted to sort of respond in real time because fall 2021 into winter 2022, we have a lot of schools are starting to reopen, libraries are starting to reopen, and challenging enough for everybody in public service working through COVID, and then having to deal with an onslaught of scrutiny, and frankly, in some cases threatening like educators and librarians about what they were buying and putting on the shelves. So the committee started February 2022, and one of the biggest things we wanted to do was just support people in real time in terms of if a challenge comes to your door with a comic book challenge, like what can you do before a challenge comes, during a challenge, and afterwards. One of the things that we were hearing from a lot of folks is that I think a lot of people talk about censorship in a vacuum. Nobody wants to be pro-censorship, but right. But few people maybe have had that experience or have really thought through what that looks like when somebody comes into your school or library and says, I don't think you should have genderqueer on your shelves. So what we were finding especially is any schools or libraries that maybe had some preparedness, they had preparedness specifically for text-only books. They knew how to defend, for example, To Kill a Mockingbird or Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, which are historically two of the most banned and challenged books, but really didn't have policy or protocol for talking about comics, explicitly talking about visuals in comics. So one of the things that has been happening and has continued to happen, so we had like more challenges last year than ever before, is people taking images from comic titles out of context.
Of course.
Yeah, they do so well with that. And I think especially a title like Genderqueer by Maya Kobe, this was originally published as an adult title, published by Oni. And it is a title that has gotten a lot of attention, and it did win an ALA Alex Award, which is an award for adult titles that might have some applicability or relevance for teen audience, but it's not a teen title. I mean, it is published as an adult title, and yet I think what we're seeing is so many misperceptions still about comics, especially with genderqueer. One of the things we've heard from some libraries is because it's published in full color, I think that it's especially that perception that it should be for kids or somehow enticing to kids. We had heard from one library that it was almost like candy on the shelf, and oh my gosh, some child might pick this up and question their gender identity. First of all, like that's cool. Like that's why there's books like that out there.
Why it's there,
Right. So we started, very much as a short-term committee. We are now a standing committee. Last year, we actually had Maya Kobe join us for our panel during ALA Annual, which was actually held in Washington, D.C. Was one of the strangest experiences probably of my life. It was one of my first big trips post-COVID. And Maya Kobe was on the panel. And we had heard alerts that the panel was going to be protested, actually, from people who are attending the conference. So presumably librarians, like library workers or people within publishing who had problems with this title. And we didn't get any protests because the panel was on the same day that Roe v. Wade was overturned in Washington.
Oh, my God.
What timing, yeah.
Holy smokes.
It was maybe doubly weird because I used that trip in Washington to do a research trip for my PhD, and I was actually at Library of Congress in their and archives, looking at Wortham's collection. So it was
Wow.
it was a weird moment.
Yeah.
That's a joining of so many different things and one time. Holy smokes.
Yeah. I got COVID too. It was a weird
Oh.
trip.
Yeah, definitely not
geez.
Wow.
post-COVID, right?
Yeah,
Still
yeah.
very much current COVID.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is all to say the committee has been around for about a year and a half, and really the objective is to support frontline library workers, have a little bit more information about what to do. Comics, so the American Library Association Office of Intellectual Freedom introduces every year in April, they'll release their list of top 10 most banned and challenged titles. This year, they just released it. There are 13 titles because there's a few ties for the top spots.
Jeepers.
And Genderqueer again made the top spot, but there's a new edition, Mike Curato's Flamer, which is again semi-autobiographical, based a little bit on Curato's experiences growing up, questioning their sexual identity, and also sort of being in an organization like the Boy Scouts. Like, where does that fit within traditional depictions of masculinity? So Flamer is now on the list. But I think an important thing to point out is this list is not comprehensive. The Office of Intellectual Freedom estimates that about 85% of all challenges go unreported. So there's a lot of stuff happening. There's a lot of stuff being pulled off the shelf or maybe not purchased for shelves that we actually aren't aware of. And a lot of that stuff we know historically and currently tends to be visual materials. So whether it's picture books or comics, and especially visual materials that are either explicitly written for children or perceived to be intended for children. So historically, Watchmen has made the list because back in the early days of libraries, a lot of folks had all ages comic sections, and well, you can imagine how that went.
The issue of visual content versus prose content, and whether or not something might be challenged or restricted, if the offending material is depicted in a drawing versus text, is a really interesting one to me as an art historian, because I feel like as a culture, we spend a lot of time in our education systems teaching people like critical analysis of text. Like, that's what school pretty much is. And you don't get any visual analysis of images. You don't get any like specific focused how to critically read images in education unless you are an art historian. And I feel like that gap in education is part of why we're so much more impacted by images, because I mean, obviously, like, yes, they are more immediate, but like there's just, I feel like something scary about them because people are not taught how to engage with them critically.
Right.
Oh, no, I think, Tia, that's such a good point. And I was thinking, especially with your background, you bring so much to the table with this, with the visual analysis. It's crazy to think about, I'm in a PhD in history program now, and one of my specialties within the program is actually looking at the teaching of history. And there's so much discussion about having students, whether they're graduating high school or graduating college, to come out with a set of critical inquiry skills, especially visual. And yet there is almost no pedagogical practice that's actually built in terms of what you're actually doing in the classroom to give students those skills. I mean, we know that students are actively disencouraged from drawing as they start to graduate through elementary grades. And in terms of how we talk about literacy, comics are still discussed as quote unquote stepping stones to literacy. And that's a big problem. And yet here we have these images having such an impact, and we know, thank you so much, I think emerging research in education, I think especially Nick Sousanis's 2016 book on flattening, which was based on his PhD dissertation in education, he talks so much about the visual complexity that we all know can exist in comic panels. And yet I would definitely say there's still an educational bias against visual images, especially visual images with text. And I don't think that that's creating a climate that is beneficial right now. So many of the librarians we've spoken to, they are still, unfortunately, their own islands. Like, it tends to be one person at a school or library buying all the comics for their school or library.
Mm-hmm.
There doesn't tend to be as much. It's starting to change. I do believe it is, but there aren't as much broad comics readership as we would like to see.
Right.
And so when a challenge comes, I think it creates an environment in which folks are much more likely to be like, oof, this is just a comic book. Like, we don't want to worry about having the kind of scrutiny that might come to our door. We should just remove this from the shelf or move it to a different section.
Yeah, there's still, I
Right.
think, that lingering sort of miasma of the old comics code, right? And like, comics are mad,
Yeah.
bad, dangerous to know, right? Like, they're going to corrupt the
Mhm.
youth no matter what they are. And especially if people are not being exposed to comics, if they're not engaging with comics, all they really have to go on is that kind of like misconception.
Right. I mean, that's what I think is kind of interesting, because this is not the first time that comics have been challenged or banned. I mean, it's something that's been going on for decades, ever since comics existed. And the emergence of the comics code in the 50s was a direct reaction to that, but it still happens. Like, I'm old enough to remember that was a big thing in the 90s. There's a lot of comic book shops being shut down because they were selling anime that was explicit. And it's like, well, a kid might pick this up. And like, it's amazing to me, there's still that perception of comics primarily being for kids, so therefore we have to protect the kids. Won't someone think of the children? God forbid they pick up a comic that's like,
okay, but
has anything questionable in it.
that's a really interesting nuanced like aspect of this, I think, though, as someone whose job it was to actually like assign content warnings or like age ratings to all of that content. There is some anime in there that I don't think anyone should be reading. Like, there is an anime out there that if you are a fan, I think I should call 911. So like, and I really, like, I'm being facetious, right? Like, I understand that like a lot of these books are created in a culture that just has different norms about some of these things. But like, at what point and obviously shutting down shops is not the right thing to do, but like,
no,
there is a point at which you do have to be able to make reasonable curatorial or like curricula decisions or even business decisions, where you may or may not carry something, or maybe you like have it behind the curtain, or like provide certain kind of content warnings or age ratings, which is, it should be information for the reader.
Right.
It shouldn't be like used to target certain groups or like in a bad faith way, but it is used in a bad faith way. And so I sometimes feel like we are forced to accept everything because we don't want to, because the people who are doing these challenges are kind of like setting the terms of the discussion, which is doing us a disservice.
Oh, no, I think that's such a good point, because it does feel, I think, I would say within librarianship and within schools, it sort of feels like we're reactionary instead of being more proactive. So a little tongue in cheek, we have called our toolkit for preparing for and addressing challenges, Be Prepared, with sort of a nod to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, sort of the, sentiment of don't panic and be prepared, and, carry a towel. And I do think that if folks have a better understanding of what they're up against, but also understanding the law a little bit better. And material is not inherently obscene. A material has to be proven, quote unquote, obscene in a court of law, and it has to pass a community standards test. And community standards is, there's not, every community is different. Not a lawyer, but especially with a lot of comic censorship stuff. I mean, this has been something that's been debated going back to the 1940s. One of the things about my research is I'm really also trying to recontextualize the fact that, most folks are quite familiar if they're familiar with comic censorship, they know Wortham, they know the 1954 U.S. Senate hearings, the Senate subcommittee hearings on juvenile delinquency in comic books. They may not know that, for example, legislation was first introduced actually in Canada in 1949. They introduced crime comics under the criminal code under the obscenity clause. And in this case, the Canadian example was even cited from lawmakers in New York in the early 1950s. You have similar legislation going on in the UK under the Harmful Publications Act, which was especially harmful publications and young persons Act. You have similar legislation going on in Australia, Belgium, elsewhere. So this was kind of like much larger than I think people talk about. And it was very much a climate of fear. You also have, like, this is post World War II. It's the Cold War. I mean, kids are growing up, doing drills in schools in which they're hiding under their desks in case, a nuclear bomb is dropped on them. So there's a lot of fear. I would say not dissimilar from today, like coming out of, and 100%, we are not in a post-COVID era, but we sort of are, quote unquote. It's a very weird time to be in. And I think that such a pervasive climate of fear and also worry around children. And I think we have this precedent for sort of, quote unquote, acceptable censorship, that if we're somehow protecting children, then it's acceptable, it's okay. And I think given the content that is being targeted, let's say books like Genderqueer or Flamer, it's incredibly frustrating because we talk about misinformation campaigns, and, the American Pediatric Association has embraced gender affirming care for years, and that is a medical best practice. And so having a book like Genderqueer on the shelf, for adults, or there's other books for younger ages. Corey Silverberg and Fiona Smith's Sex is a Funny Word is a great book for elementary kids about sexual and gender identity, and nonfiction award-winning book. And that book has also been targeted. And it's frustrating because this is like a book that is illustrating in a way that's super relatable for kids and their families and is based on medical best practice. And yet, people are frustrated by it. And I think because of the visual medium, I mean, it's impactful for a reason.
I was tasked at my old job to create a set of visual criteria for determining whether or not an image has the intention to arouse.
Whoa. Intention
Which,
to
like,
arouse.
first of all, I hate that phrase because I neither know nor care what the artist's intention is. And I think that that's impossible to know. I think that it makes more sense to begin at the impact of the image, right? Like that, I think you can measure more objectively. But in any case, some of the criteria that I came up with was things like, I kind of drew on film theory. What are the angles? What's the camera angle? Where are you as the viewer being positioned in the scene? There are a lot of Avatar books, like the Jungle Fever series, where or Jungle Fever, no, Jungle something. God, there's so many of those horrible books. Anyway, where in the sex scenes, the viewer is literally drawn in as the man in the act. So that was kind of my sort of like cornerstone of, is this intended to arouse? Like, where are you, the viewer, being positioned? Other things are like, is there verisimilitude in the drawing, or is it like a more sketchy rendering? Is there like shading? Is the shading really realistic? Are the colors really realistic, or is it just kind of like outlines of people like in a more cartoony style? And it's funny because I think that in one way people would be like, if it's cartoony, then they're trying to appeal to kids. But I actually feel like that sort of that removes the erotic aspect, because then it's just like a thing being depicted and not like with intention to arouse necessarily. I know. I know. It's a terrible phrase. It's terrible.
It honestly, It honestly sounds like a Spinal Tap song intended to arouse. So.
But it's honestly like it's something that I think a lot of people think is possible to discern and is in fact necessary
Right. Yep.
to evaluate material as needing censorship in some way or like special, you know what I mean? Like people really genuinely believe, I think, that that's what they should be focusing on here instead of the impact. And like Amie, you mentioned like the community, I forget the phrase that you used exactly.
Community standard.
Community standard. Thank you. Yeah. Like we can't really know what the artist intended, but I think that we can measure the community impact and the what is the community standard, because something in one place may be completely obscene and taboo and not in another place. And so you just kind of, I don't know, like I'm also, cultural relativity is hard. It's really tough.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, I think you see that with, video game parameters, like how if a game is released in certain countries, they'll have to do, some small alterations based on what is acceptable in that country versus another country. So there's definitely precedent. And it's something that's so hard to determine, but it's something that also should be kind of a moving target, like our communities change. And also to have, I think what we're seeing now is a lot of these groups, and I'm not gonna give them more airtime than they have by naming them. But they're very well organized, and so a lot of the things that we're seeing is there are lists of books being distributed, bulleted talking points, and one of the best ways, I think, to push back against that is to be similarly organized and say, we actually, just because one person has an issue, that doesn't mean that all parents have an issue. Or if one reader has an issue, that's not all readers. So one of the biggest things we've been recommending for schools and libraries is to go back to their collection development policies and also their challenge policies. So your collection development policy is basically why you buy what you buy and your justification for it. What we have realized is a lot of libraries haven't updated their collection development policy in more than 10 years. So not only do they not reflect buying different formats like comics that you might buy maybe from your comic book store, but also you're buying maybe in digital formats. So you really need to make sure that that is a document you update every 3 to 5 years, ideally. And then you should have a challenge policy so that if somebody comes to your school or library and says, I have a problem with this, you need to be like, hey, here's our challenge policy. Please fill this out. And, the first question should be, have you read this? Yes. Have you read this in its entirety? Yes. Why specifically do you have an issue with this? And to really, give reasons for it. There are tools out there. I mean, Common Sense Media has been around for decades, and it's sort of community assessments. And I would say they definitely err on the more conservative sides. And I mean, Common Sense Media has like a good rating for something like Genderqueer or New Kid. And yet you have folks going against these very awarded titles that have, starred reviews across a variety of reviewing media. And I think the onus should really be on the individual coming forward with this challenge. And what we are finding is that most of these challenges, they're not starting, especially from the young readers. You have some states in which we have teenagers awesomely pushing back and being like, this is ridiculous. This is not what we're looking for. Like our First Amendment right is also important. I mean, if we go a little bit larger internationally in the UN Declaration for the Rights of the Child, I mean, the right for children to have within public and school libraries a spectrum of media is written right in there to the rights of the child. And I think we're seeing this very much a push and pull around, perceived community rights over individual rights. Even like we have I think people love to articulate freedom of speech. And yet here we are taking, people who are under 18 and saying they don't have the right to choose for themselves, or their families don't have a right to choose for themselves what's appropriate. And that's a big problem.
I mean, it's freedom of speech as long as I control who has the freedom, right? That's
It's tough though, because this kind of goes back to what I was saying about how they've made it impossible to have a nuanced conversation about this because then they try to equate, for example, like allowing marginalized people to create autobiographical works to their right to disseminate propaganda or misinformation, right? And so they like start throwing all these straw man arguments out to really like make it impossible to have good faith nuanced discussions about this, because it's like the paradox of tolerance is I guess too complex for some people to understand, or like they're just being intellectually dishonest about it. And so I think that you're absolutely right that we have to kind of take a leaf from their book and organize the way that they organize, especially on community levels. Like they are taking over school boards, they are taking over like, local government, and that's how they're building momentum for a lot of this. And so that's something I think that people need to look at if they want to push back against these challenges. But I also think that we just need to figure out a way to shut down those bad faith straw man arguments, because like there just isn't a good way to solve this problem without getting into the nuance.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, 100%. I think happily there's at least some examples we can point to. In Virginia, the ACLU, along with Oni Press and Maya Kobe yourself, was named in an obscenity lawsuit. And, we had some private citizens who actually wanted to not only bar genderqueer from being on school and public library shelves, but wanted to bar it from private sale in the state of Virginia. And
wow.
I know. The judge was like, no.
Right.
That's insane. I'm sorry. Has anybody read this book? Has anybody read this book?
I guess not. Yeah.
Sorry.
No. I mean, it's such a good point. Like we're even seeing, it's a YA book called Lawn Boy. I'm sorry, I don't have the author's name at the top of my head, but what's been interesting too with a lot of these circulated talking points is they're actually conflating these two books. So Genderqueer by Maya Kobe, Lawn Boy, which is a text-only YA book, and Lawn Boy has some scenes of consensual sexual interactions between sort of a teenager and a younger adult. And they're saying that genderqueer has these things. And I'm like, no. I mean, Maya Kobe spends a lot of time in genderqueer talking about discovering your asexual identity. I'm like, have you read genderqueer? This is not about two men having sex.
Right.
So I want people to have discussions like that, to be like, actually, genderqueer does not have. Can you point to me where two men are having sex in genderqueer?
Show me in the comic book where this is happening.
Yeah.
Is the sex in the room with us right now?
Yeah.
But also it's like, I'm sorry, but is everything in our entire society not geared towards grooming young women to accept sexual attention from older men? Like, is that not a thing that we all live with?
No, entirely. Well, and this is, I think, such a frustration seeing books like Sex is a Funny Word that I mentioned earlier by Corey Silverberg and Fiona Smith. I mean, this is a book, Corey Silverberg and Fiona Smith are both Canadian. It won a nonfiction award in Canada, but it's published widely throughout North America. And it talks about consent, which is such an important thing to give kiddos the visuals and the text and the tools to talk about. And one of the best things about this book is it's a book meant for kiddos to read with their people and like talk about consent, whether it's hugging or touching or any range of consent. And I'm like, wow, this is actually a super important book. And yet this is a book that's being pulled off the shelf. So I think, what we are seeing is a lot of, parents and communities pushing back and saying, one or two parents does not speak for the community. Like most of our libraries, they don't have one community too. They have communities, and those are always changing. And I think as folks are starting to get more involved, we are seeing, people pushing back. We are hearing, about libraries fighting challenges and winning. It's a lot. And, even in putting together the work that the committee has done, or even the webinar series that we're finishing up on Wednesday, we've had trouble having panelists come on the webinar series because a lot of folks have fought challenges at their library, but at great personal cost. And I don't think that's talked about enough.
Huh.
And yeah, so I think people need to understand that this is not in a vacuum. This is happening all throughout. I actually this is only my second podcast taping in a few years, which is crazy, but also, as we talked about, past few years have been weird. But I had done a podcast taping in the fall, and it was we now have Australian colleagues. So the Australia Library Association, they started their own graphic novel and comics roundtable a few years ago, and they're amazing. They're at ALIA Graphic, which is the Australian Library and Information Association. And I did a podcast taping for them in the fall, because they wanted to hear a little bit about the work of the committee and just the general climate of bans and challenges in North America. And they've now had challenges in Australia. And so it's happening. Whether or not people are talking about it widely, like, it is happening at school boards and in libraries. And I think the more prepared people are to meet the challenge, the much better we can face this. So.
Yeah.
I know, yeah, we're don't have a ton of time to really unpack everything, and it's a big topic, but I guess what's really frustrating is being a comic fan, it feels like you're kind of powerless in the face of this. You're dealing with governments, you're dealing with local organizations, and it's almost like very frustrating, because as a comic fan, you want to proselytize and say, like, no, these are great comics, you just need to read them, but your voice gets drowned out. So it's very frustrating. Is there anything, very briefly, like maybe as fans, you think would be beneficial to kind of combat this, even on a very small level?
Oh, I think that is such a great question. And every time we do these kind of like interviews or podcasts, people are like, wow, the situation is dire. And I'm like, okay, 100%. But I think, I get down to even just the work we all have been doing for, 10 plus years, which is to really make more people be comic fans and advocates.
Right.
So, Kate Beaton's Ducks, which I didn't talk about because I just finished it, but it's amazing. Yes. And oh my gosh, it actually just won Canada Reads. So this is competition in Canada in which people sort of pick their favorite book and then argue for the book on a national platform. Wow. And it won, and it's the first graphic novel to win. And I think it's important to talk about that. Or Jerry Craft's New Kid winning the Newbery. Mm-hmm. These are not just great comics. They're also books that have won a number of awards. Mm-hmm. I mean, Maya Kobe's Genderqueer, when he was on the panel with us last year, I was just so struck by the fact that your book has won so many awards, and yet we're having this conversation. Yeah. And I think if you go back a few more years, Mariko and Jillian's Tamaki's This One Summer, right? It won so many awards, and it was the most banned and challenged book of 2016. So it's kind of not without precedent, but these are award-winning books. And I think that advocacy and talking about it is really important, because I don't think that everyone realizes that it's happening, or even happening to the extent that it is. So even if you don't have kiddos in local schools, like, get involved, talk about how the freedom to read is a right that everybody has. And, that goes hand in hand with freedom of speech and the rights of the child. And this should be something we talk about in schools, and that we are lending our support to. Support your local state chapters of the ACLU, support your local libraries and schools. And I think with more people standing up in many ways, large and small, we can win this fight.
Yeah. Well, there's a positive note to end on, I guess, right?
Yeah, I was going to say that is the perfect way to end this. Amie, this has been fantastic. There's so much more I think we probably could talk about, so we will have to have you back, hopefully sooner than the last time we had you on here. But I would love to talk more about this. Love to hear what else you're reading and all that other stuff. So thank you so much for insight, and folks, you've heard it. Get involved. Go help out your local library if you can. Sounds like great advice. Overall, whether it's for helping comic books or not. But yeah, I guess to wrap things up, I guess, Amie, where can folks find you on the internet if they want to just say hello, or where can they look for your work, I guess, in the future?
100%. So I'm definitely a more sporadic tweeter these days, but you can find me on Twitter at LibraryLandia. And the Graphic Novel and Comics Roundtable, we are across social media platforms at libcomics, so LIBCOMIX, and we are also on Discord now.
Awesome. Well, I'll make sure to get all of those links in the show notes for folks who want to get involved and say hello. I guess to wrap things up, I mean, Tia, Paul, thank you so much for your time today. Amie, thank you so much for yours. Next week's show is going to be me and Nick and Kate. We're going to be talking about the wildest manga that Nick and Kate can find. Or Kate Lanfear, I should say. They read a lot of the out there manga, hopefully stuff that Tia would not want to get off of their platform on the internet, but stuff that is out there a little bit different than just your typical shonen stuff. So I'm excited to see what they throw my way so I can give just a blind assessment on that. Infinity Shred is the best band in the universe. They do all of our music. Zander is there to just look you in the eye and reassure you that everything's going to be okay. He edits the shows. Thank you so much. I want to say again, thank you to Tia and Paul. Thank you, Amie, once more for being on the show. And until next time, comics are good, and so are you.